3 knocks. 3 in the morning. The kind of sound that splits a house in half. Garrett Dunn opened the front door with engine grease still black under his nails, still wearing the smell of the night shift. The woman on his porch said one sentence. "Your wife asked me to find you?" He did not move. 4 years no one had spoken Elena's name to his face. The woman held out an envelope. The handwriting on it belonged to someone dead since winter of 2020. Garrett looked at the envelope, looked at her, and shut the door. The envelope fell to the porch step. He did not lock it. That was the detail he would think about later, that his hand reached the deadbolt and stopped, as if some part of him already knew. He stood in the kitchen with his back against the wall, breathing through his nose, slow and controlled, the way a man breathes when the room has gone sideways but his son is asleep 20 feet down the hall. Through the gap in the curtain he could see the porch. She was still standing there. Under the yellow porch light he saw her clearly for the first time, a thin-strapped nightgown, a cardigan thrown on without buttoning, sandals mismatched on her feet, one slightly twisted as if she had jammed them on while already moving toward the car. This was not a woman who had dressed for a visit. This was a woman who had bolted out of bed in the middle of the night and driven here without stopping to think. Whatever brought her to Briar Falls, North Carolina at 3 in the morning, it could not wait. He recognized the handwriting on the envelope. The way Elena made her capital G with that long trailing tail, the way she folded the corner of envelopes into a triangle, a habit from college she never explained and he never asked about. 4 years since he had seen that handwriting. 4 years since he had tried and failed to forget it. The memory hit before he could stop it. Elena in the hospital bed 4 years ago. Thin, eyes hollow but still holding him with that look, the one that said she was already somewhere else but refusing to go until she finished. Her hand gripping his with more strength than her body should have had left. She said, "I made sure someone will come when the time is right." He thought it was the morphine talking. At 3:47 in the morning, Garrett opened the door again. The woman had not knocked a second time. She had not left. The envelope lay on the step between them. He bent down and picked it up. "Who are you?" His voice was flat, stripped of everything but the question. "Linnea Prescott," she said. "Elena's college roommate. She gave me this 4 years ago with a date to open it." He did not open the envelope. He carried it inside, set it on the kitchen counter, brewed coffee, placed a cup in front of her without asking whether she wanted one. It was not hospitality. It was processing his hands needed something to do, while his mind caught up with what his chest already knew. Linnea explained. Elena had given her a sealed envelope with instructions to open it on the day Theo turned 9. Inside was a letter and a name that was not Garrett Dunn. Linnea looked at him across the counter. She wrote a different name. She said, "It's your real one." Garrett said nothing. The coffee cup in his hand did not tremble, but he set it down slower than a man sets down a cup he is not thinking about. "You should leave before my son wakes up." Linnea stood. She left a business card on the counter. Linnea Prescott, CEO, Vantage Cyber, Charlotte. "She asked me to protect something that belongs to your son," she said. "I intend to keep that promise." Then she walked out, nightgown, mismatched sandals, the faint scent of sleep still trailing behind her in the kitchen after the screen door closed. Garrett sat at that counter until dawn. The envelope stayed sealed. The coffee went cold. The next morning moved the way every morning in Briar Falls moved slow. Ordinary. Ordinary on purpose. Garrett drove Theo to school in the pickup, the one with the rust spot on the tailgate he kept meaning to sand down. He stopped at the corner bakery for a roll, watched his son disappear through the front doors of Briar Falls Elementary with a backpack too big for him. Everything looked the same. Nothing was. At the shop, Garrett worked under the hood of a Ford F-150 with a timing belt problem. His hands moved through the routine, but his mind was somewhere between a hospital room 4 years ago and a kitchen counter 3 hours ago. He cross-threaded the same bolt twice. Earl, the shop owner, built like a mailbox, 31 years behind that counter, leaned against the lift and watched. "You sick?" Garrett shook his head. Earl was not the kind of man who asked twice. That afternoon, Garrett came home before pickup time. The house was empty, the afternoon light falling through the kitchen window in a long stripe across the linoleum. He sat at the table, pulled the envelope from the counter, and opened it. 3 pages. Blue ink, the same pen Elena always used, the kind she bought in packs of 12 from the university bookstore, and never switched away from. Her handwriting was steady. She had written this on a good day, when the medication held the pain at arm's length long enough for her to think clearly. She wrote that she knew he would disappear after she died. She knew he would blame himself. She knew he would take Theo and vanish because that was what Garrett did. He protected by retreating. He loved by hiding. She wrote that she understood, and that understanding was not the same as permission. Then she wrote his name, his real name, Garrett Aldrich Kessler, co-founder, Arcellus Defense Technologies. The next paragraph changed the weight of the letter in his hands. Before she died, Elena had quietly copied everything: founding documents, original patent filings, board minutes, shareholder agreements, every piece of paper that proved Garrett Kessler owned 51% of a company now valued at $2.1 billion. She had sent duplicates to Linnea Prescott with instructions to activate them at the right time. The last line was underlined twice, the pen pressed so hard it nearly tore through. "They took your company. Don't let them take Theo's future." Garrett read it through. He folded the pages along the same creases Elena had made, and placed them in the kitchen drawer, the same drawer where he kept their wedding photo face down. His knuckles went white on the edge of the table. He sat there until the stripe of light from the window had moved all the way across the floor. He did not call Linnea. He did not call anyone. That evening, Theo asked why his dad was not eating. Garrett sat down, spooned food onto his son's plate, asked what he learned at school. Theo talked about a lesson on the solar system. He wanted to know why Saturn had rings and Earth did not. Garrett explained: patient, calm ice and rock caught in orbit, held by gravity, too far to fall and too close to leave. But his eyes were focused on something past Theo's shoulder, something in a middle distance that had nothing to do with planets. Inside, everything was moving. Outside, he was the father who washed the dishes after dinner, checked the locks, and stood in his son's doorway 30 seconds longer than usual before turning off the hall light. 3 days passed. Linnea Prescott did not leave Briar Falls. She checked into the Pinecrest Motor Lodge, the only motel in town, the kind with windows that faced the parking lot and curtains that did not quite meet in the middle. She worked from her laptop, took video calls with Vantage Cyber's board, drank bad coffee from the lobby machine. But every morning she drove past the shop on Main Street. Slowly, she did not stop. She just confirmed he was still there, still under a hood, still alive in the quiet, ordinary way he had chosen. In a town of 8,000 people, a woman from Charlotte staying alone at the Pinecrest was news before lunch. Earl asked Garrett on Tuesday. That woman from Charlotte, still at the Pinecrest. She a lawyer? Bill collector? Garrett tightened a lug nut and said nothing. Dolores at the corner diner asked on Wednesday. Pretty thing staying alone at the motel. Friend of yours? Garrett set his $1.50 on the counter. No. The way he said it made Dolores pour his coffee and find something else to talk about. On the fourth day, Linnea pulled into the shop not to find Garrett, but because her car had genuinely died. The starter motor was gone, probably from the dozen times she had turned the engine on and off, while Garrett was the only mechanic free. He looked at the car, popped the hood without being asked, and said, "Starter motor, 40 minutes. She sat on the plastic chair outside the bay door and watched him work. His hands were a mechanic's hands, calloused, oil-darkened, scarred across the knuckles from years of close work in tight spaces, but the way he read the diagnostic codes on the control module without reaching for a manual, the way his fingers moved across the circuit board with surgical precision, isolating the fault in half the time a trained technician would have needed, that was not a man who had learned engines from a book. That was an engineer's touch, a mind that understood systems at the architecture level. She noticed. She filed it away and said nothing. When it was done, Garrett wiped his hands on the shop rag. $42. Linnea paid without discussion. Then, quietly, as if the question were small, "Did you read it?" He wiped the same hand again, not looking at her. "I read it." A silence long enough for a truck to pass on Main Street and its engine sound to disappear completely. Then, "It doesn't change anything." Linnea's voice carried no pressure. She placed the truth between them the way someone places a glass on a table carefully, without force, close enough to reach. "It changes everything for your son." She got in her car and drove away. That night, after Theo was asleep, Garrett opened the kitchen drawer, and read Elena's letter a second time slower, the way you read something when you are no longer looking for information, but for the person behind the words. He stopped at the final line, the one written smaller, as if added last. Let Linnea help. She's the only one I trusted besides you. He set the letter on the counter. He did not put it back in the drawer. He left it next to her business card, two objects belonging to two women, side by side under the kitchen light, like two halves of a sentence he was not yet ready to finish. The black Cadillac Escalade arrived in Briar Falls on a Thursday morning. Parked in front of the real estate office on Main Street, like it owned the sidewalk and most of what was behind it. Vernon Straith stepped out in a coat that cost more than most cars in the lot. The stated reason was an inspection of the industrial park development on the east side of town, a project funded by Arcellus Defense Technologies, the kind of investment that made small-town councils return phone calls on the first ring. The actual reason was a name on a report. Arcellus Internal Security had flagged it. Linnea Prescott, CEO of Vantage Cyber, had been in Briar Falls for 4 days and had been asking about a man named Garrett Dunn. Vernon knew who Linnea was. He knew she had been Elena's closest friend in college. He knew Elena had been gathering documents before she died, that much his security people had told him 4 years ago, though the paperwork surrounding Elena's death said otherwise. What Vernon had not known, until now, was who Elena had sent those documents to. The fact that it was Linnea Prescott, a woman with the resources and the technical infrastructure of a cybersecurity firm behind her, made the situation considerably worse than a grieving widow's college friend showing up to ask questions. Lunch was at the only restaurant in Briar Falls, with a private room, a back table at the steakhouse behind a curtain that smelled like 30 years of smoke and closed deals. Vernon sat across from Alderman Roy Phelps, chairman of the town council, a man who owed Vernon the way small towns owe the companies that keep their lights on. The Arcellus development contract had saved Briar Falls from bankruptcy 2 years ago, and Phelps had signed every paper Vernon put in front of him without reading past the first paragraph. Vernon asked about Garrett Dunn, his voice casual, pleasant, like asking about weather in a town he did not live in and did not care about. Phelps shrugged. Just a mechanic. Quiet. Got a kid. Vernon cut his steak. His eyes did not match his voice. Keep an eye on him for me, Roy. At the same hour, in room 11 of the Pinecrest, Linnea was on a call with her technical team at Vantage Cyber. She had asked them to pull archived records from Arcellus for the period between 2018 and 2021, the years Garrett Kessler was erased from company history. They found a digital fingerprint enterprise-grade data deletion software, the kind only 3 companies in the world supplied. One of those 3 had been a former client of Vantage Cyber itself. Linnea recognized the tool's signature the way a locksmith recognizes pick marks. This was not a business dispute. Someone had erased Garrett Kessler from existence with professional precision, and they had spent a fortune doing it. That evening, Garrett pulled down the shop's rolling door at closing time. He heard it before he saw it, the low, heavy rumble of an engine that did not belong to any vehicle in Briar Falls, moving too slow for something with somewhere to go. The black Escalade passed under the streetlight, its windows tinted past legal, the driver invisible behind glass that reflected the neon of the closed barber shop. The plates read Arc Def. Garrett stood still with a wrench in his right hand, and his chest rising faster than he wanted. His face did not change. He recognized those plates. He recognized everything they carried, and for the first time in 4 years, he was afraid not for himself, for the boy at the end of the street who did not know his last name was borrowed. 10 o'clock that night. Theo was asleep. The house was quiet in the way houses are quiet, when a child is dreaming and a father is not. Garrett stood in the kitchen looking at 2 things on the counter: Linnea's business card and Elena's letter. 2 objects belonging to 2 women, side by side on the same strip of old formica. One woman was dead. The other had shown up in a nightgown at 3 in the morning to keep a promise the dead one made. He picked up his phone and dialed. The call lasted 90 seconds. Not a word wasted. That black SUV today, Arcellus plates. Vernon's here. Linnea's voice was awake and unsurprised. I know. I saw it this afternoon. A long silence. Then Garrett, low and flat, come to the shop tomorrow. After closing. 7. It was the first time he had invited her anywhere. He hung up without saying goodbye. The next evening at 7, the shop was closed. The neon sign was dark. Only the single bulb behind the counter threw yellow light across the oil-stained floor, catching the chrome of tools on the pegboard. Garrett sat in the old swivel chair behind the register. Linnea sat across from him in the plastic customer chair. 2 cups of coffee between them, black, steam rising, and then not. He talked. For the first time in 4 years, he told someone the story he had buried under a new name and a night shift job in a town that did not ask questions. Arcellus. He and Vernon co-founded it in 2016. Garrett was the technical mind. Every cyber defense patent was his. Every line of code. Every architecture diagram. Vernon handled the money, the lobbying, the government contracts. When the company hit $800 million, Vernon started cutting Garrett out of decisions. When it passed $1.5 billion, Vernon transferred the core patents to a shell company registered in Delaware, with Vernon's name on every document and Garrett's on none. Elena found out. She was a researcher by training. She could read corporate filings the way most people read a grocery list. Before she could bring the evidence to a lawyer, she had a car accident on the mountain road coming back from the attorney's office. I never proved it was him. Garrett's voice was level, not shaking, not raised, but his hands on his knees had closed into fists that did not open. But I know. He told Linnea he disappeared because he was afraid Vernon would go after Theo. He took his mother's maiden name. He moved to a town small enough to hide in. He let Garrett Kessler die on paper so his son could live in peace. Linnea listened without interrupting, without offering sympathy or the kind of soft reassurance that would have made him stop talking. When he finished, she spoke in a voice as clear as a contract clause. Elena didn't ask me to avenge anything. She asked me to make sure Theo gets what's his. Legally. Garrett looked at her. Really looked not through her, not past her, not with the guarded distance he gave everyone else. He saw a woman who had driven here in a nightgown to deliver a dead woman's letter, who had stayed in a motel for a week without being asked, who had listened to the worst story he had ever told without flinching. He nodded. The motion was so small it was almost invisible. But Linnea saw it. Linnea drove to Asheville the next morning 1 hour on I-26, through fog that sat in the mountain valleys like cotton. Hank Overlea's address came from old Arcellus filings her Vantage team had pulled. The house was small, perched on a hillside with a white fence that needed painting and an old sedan in the driveway, the quiet life of a good lawyer who had chosen to disappear. Hank opened the door. 61, silver-haired, wearing the face of a man who had been carrying a debt he could not name. He saw Linnea and spoke immediately. I can't talk about Arcellus, NDA. He reached for the door. Linnea held up Elena's letter, turned to the second page. Elena had written, Hank will say no. Show him this line. He owes me the promise he made in the hospital waiting room. Hank read it. His face collapsed as if his spine had lost a vertebra, as if the thing holding him upright for 4 years had just been named aloud. He opened the door wide. Come in. What Hank told her in the next 40 minutes changed everything. Elena's car accident was not an accident. Hank had received a report from a private investigator hired by Elena herself in the weeks before she died, showing that the brake line in her car had been partially cut, not severed, scored, a careful, precise incision that allowed brake fluid to leak slowly, gradually, invisibly, until the brakes would fail under pressure at speed on the steep mountain road between the lawyer's office and home. The investigator's report was thorough, clinical, and damning, and Hank had kept it hidden for 4 years because Vernon had made a specific threat. Hank's daughter, Margaret, worked at an Arcellus subsidiary at a job Vernon had arranged as a favor that came with strings that turned into chains. Vernon promised to destroy Margaret's career, her reputation, and her life if Hank ever spoke about what he knew. Hank walked to the filing cabinet in his study, opened the second drawer, and removed a black USB drive. Inside the investigator's report, the original Arcellus founding agreement with Garrett Kessler's wet signature and internal emails from Vernon ordering the removal of Garrett's name from every company record. Hank's hand trembled when he held it out the first time Linnea had seen a man's hand shake from relief rather than fear. I've been waiting 4 years for someone brave enough to use this. I was too afraid. Elena deserved better than me. Linnea drove back to Briar Falls that night in the dark. She did not call Garrett. She knew the information about Elena would break something inside him if delivered wrong, too fast, without the right air in the room. She pulled into the motel parking lot, turned off the engine, and sat in the darkness holding the USB drive against her palm. The lot was empty. The office light buzzed, and for the first time in this story, Linnea cried. Not for Garrett, not for herself, for Elena, the woman who had known she was going to die, and had still sat down to write letters, copy documents, hire an investigator, arrange the evidence like a case file for a trial she would never attend. Elena had fought alone. Elena had planned alone. And Elena had loved her husband enough to build him a way out from a place she could never leave. The next morning at 6:30, Linnea's car was already in the shop lot when Garrett arrived to open up. He pulled the rolling door and saw her by the hood. Her eyes were swollen. No makeup, hair pulled back in a hasty knot. He knew immediately this was not small. This was not an update or a next step. It was the kind of thing that changes the temperature of a room. He did not ask in front of the street. He led her through the shop to the back storage area past the parts shelves, into the space that smelled of motor oil and cold metal and had no window facing the road. She handed him the USB drive. Then she told him. Straight. No preamble, no cushion, no softening. She told him because she respected him too much to treat him like a man who needed to be shielded from the truth. The brake line was cut. The investigator confirmed it with physical evidence. Elena had known she was being threatened. Elena had hired the investigator before she died. Garrett did not speak for a long time. The silence was the heaviest thing in the room, heavier than the engine block on the lift, heavier than the 4 years he had spent running from a suspicion he could not prove and could not release. He turned his back to Linnea and braced both hands flat on the hood of the car he had been working on, his head bowed between his arms, shoulders high and locked. He did not cry. He did not break anything. He did not shout. He just stood there, and the silence said everything a shout could not. His back, broad, calloused, built for endurance, shook once, a single tremor that moved through him like a current, then stopped. When he spoke, his voice was low and flat as a workbench. I knew. I always knew. I just couldn't prove it. A pause that had 4 years inside it, and I was afraid that if I proved it, I'd kill him. And Theo would have no one. Linnea stood 2 steps behind him. She did not touch him. She did not say she was sorry. She knew he did not need sympathy, he needed direction. Elena didn't want you to kill anyone. She wanted you to take back what's Theo's. Legally. Completely. Publicly. Garrett turned around. His eyes were dry, but something behind them had shifted. A wall removed. A lock turned. For the first time in 4 years, the expression on his face was not defense. It was something very close to trust, the kind he thought had died with Elena. How? I have a plan, Linnea said. But I need you to be Garrett Kessler again. Not tonight, not tomorrow, but soon, he nodded. No grand declaration, just a nod. That evening, he read with Theo before bed. A book about airplanes. Theo liked the chapter on propellers. The way they could push something as heavy as a plane through something as thin as air. Halfway through, Theo asked in the light, weightless voice of a child who does not know what his words carry. Dad, were you someone else before me? Garrett's hand stopped on the page. 1 beat. 2. Then, softer than anything else in this story, I was always your dad. That's the only part that matters. He kissed Theo's forehead and turned off the lamp. In the hallway, outside his son's door, Garrett leaned against the wall and closed his eyes. His hand made a fist. Opened. Made a fist again. Linnea executed the plan in 3 layers, each time to land before Vernon could react to the last. Layer 1, the full legal file transmitted to the SEC and the United States Attorney's Office in Charlotte. The founding agreement with Garrett Kessler's original signature, the patent filings, the board minutes, Vernon's internal emails. Layer 2, a summary packet delivered to the Charlotte Observer editorial desk. Not for immediate publication, for pressure. Layer 3, the investigators' report on Elena Kessler's brake line, sent directly to the FBI's Criminal Investigation Division. Vernon heard about it through the people whose loyalty he had purchased. Alderman Phelps called to report that Linnea was causing trouble in town. Vernon convened an emergency session at Briar Falls Town Hall, ostensibly about the industrial park timeline. The real agenda was to use his leverage to discredit Garrett and push him out before Linnea's evidence reached anyone who could act on it. He arrived with 2 Charlotte attorneys, a communications advisor, and Phelps seated at the head of the council table looking like a man who had bet on the wrong horse. Garrett walked into town hall wearing his shop uniform. The name Dunn stitched on the chest pocket in faded thread, grease on his hands that he had not bothered to wash, because washing them would have meant this moment mattered to him in a way he was not willing to show. He brought no lawyer. He brought no files. He brought nothing except the face Vernon Straith had not seen in 4 years. Vernon saw him from across the room. The moment froze. Vernon recognized the jaw, the eyes, the way Garrett stood with his weight balanced, and his shoulders set and his hands still at his sides. That was Garrett Kessler. No matter what name was on the uniform, no matter how much grease was under his nails, Vernon recovered quickly, the way a man recovers who has spent decades managing rooms. He turned to the council and declared Garrett Dunn an imposter with no standing in the community, a man who should be investigated rather than listened to. Garrett stood still. He did not speak. He did not need to. The town hall door opened. Linnea walked in, and the room recalibrated. This was not the woman in the nightgown at 3 a.m. This was not the motel guest with the broken starter motor. She wore a black suit cut to precision, her hair pulled back tight, carrying a legal briefcase she set on the table with the weight of something that had been a long time coming. This was Linnea Prescott, CEO of Vantage Cyber, appearing as legal representative for Garrett Aldrich Kessler. She addressed the council in a voice that was precise, cold, and completely without emotion, the voice of a woman who had cried in a motel parking lot 2 nights ago and had no intention of crying now. She laid out the facts. Garrett Kessler was co-founder of Arcellus Defense Technologies. His identity had been unlawfully erased from corporate records, and Vernon Straith was now the subject of federal investigation into securities fraud, destruction of evidence. And she paused, her eyes finding Vernon's across the room, and she held them obstruction in the investigation of Elena Kessler's death. Vernon shot to his feet. His face turned a color that did not belong in a public meeting. "This is a setup. She's lying." His lawyers pulled him down, but it was too late. The panic in his voice was not the sound of an innocent man. Everyone in the room heard it. 48 hours after town hall, the FBI executed a search warrant at Arcellus Defense Headquarters in Charlotte. 6 a.m. 3 black sedans, blue windbreakers. The Charlotte Observer ran the story by afternoon. Defense Tech CEO, under federal investigation co-founder, resurfaces after 4 years. There was no photograph of Vernon in handcuffs. There was a photograph of him walking out flanked by 2 lawyers, his face the color of old concrete, and that image moved across the internet faster than his legal team could contain it. Hank Overlia testified under oath before the federal prosecutor the following morning. He confirmed that Garrett Kessler was the co-founder of Arcellus Defense Technologies. He confirmed every core patent in the company's portfolio bore Garrett's name. He produced the original founding agreement with both signatures. He produced Vernon's emails ordering the erasure. He produced the investigator's report on Elena's brake line. He wept during the deposition. 4 years of silence, pouring out of a man who had been too afraid to speak and too honest to forget, who had carried the weight of both until his hands shook whenever he opened the filing cabinet. Alderman Phelps, a politician to his marrow, read the wind and turned within the hour. He volunteered his entire email correspondence with Vernon to the federal investigators, held a press conference outside town hall, and declared he had always placed the community's interests above all else. Garrett watched the clip at the shop that afternoon. He saw Phelps smooth his tie and look into the camera with the practiced sincerity of a man who had never met a principle he would not abandon. He did not smile. He did not sneer. He turned off the screen and went back to the car on the lift. The federal court issued an order freezing Vernon Straith's shares in Arcellus and restoring Garrett Kessler's name to all founding documents and patent registrations. The full legal process would take months, perhaps longer, but the first step was done. Garrett Kessler existed again on paper. The name Vernon had spent a fortune erasing was back in ink that could not be deleted. At the shop that afternoon, Earl walked in holding his phone with the Observer article filling the screen. His face said everything his mouth was still trying to assemble. Garrett Kessler? $2 billion Garrett Kessler? He looked at the man under the hood. "That's you?" Garrett was holding a wrench. He did not look up. "I still owe you for the torque wrench I broke last month, Earl." Earl stood there with his mouth open, then he laughed. Then his eyes went wet, then he shook his head and walked back to his office, muttering something that sounded like a prayer or a curse or both. That night, Garrett called Linnea. His voice was lighter than at any point in this story, lighter the way a voice gets when a man finally sets down something he has been carrying so long he forgot it had weight. "Elena would have liked you." Linnea was quiet on the other end. A long beat, the kind of silence that has a different texture than the ones that came before, warmer, less guarded. Then, her voice slightly rough, "She did. That's why she chose me." 3 weeks later, autumn had come to Briar Falls, yellow leaves on Main Street, the air carrying that first cool edge that meant summer was finished. Garrett was still in Briar Falls, still working at the shop, but now it was a choice, not a hiding place. The difference was invisible from the outside, but it changed the way he stood, the way he looked at the street when he locked up at night. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he has decided to keep. He had talked to Theo. Not everything, not the patents, not the billions, not the brake line on a mountain road. Just enough for a 9-year-old who trusted his father. Dad used to build things for a big company. Some people were unfair to Mom and Dad. A friend of Mom's helped fix it. Theo absorbed this quietly, then asked the question that cut to the center. "The lady with the nice car?" Garrett nodded. On Saturday, Garrett brought Theo to the shop and showed him the basics of an engine. Theo held a wrench too big for his hand and tried to tighten a bolt, laughing when he cranked it too hard and Garrett had to pry it loose. Garrett watched his son's small hands, bright eyes, completely whole, and for the first time in 4 years, he saw the future. Not the past, not the hospital bed, or the mountain road, or the sealed envelope. The future, standing right in front of him, holding a wrench wrong and grinning about it. Linnea came back to Briar Falls on a Tuesday. This time not for a promise to Elena, not for legal files or a USB drive or a hearing. She parked in front of the shop, walked in, and set a box of coffee on the counter, the same brand Garrett had brewed for her on the first night, the night she stood on his porch in a nightgown at 3 in the morning. Garrett looked at the box, looked at her, and for the first time in the entire story, he smiled. Not much, one corner of his mouth lifting, his eyes softening by half a shade. But enough. Enough for Linnea to know the door was open. "I have a meeting in Charlotte at 9 tomorrow, she said. Garrett wiped his hands on the shop rag. "That's a 2-hour drive." Linnea held his gaze. "I know." She did not explain why she was in Briar Falls the night before a morning meeting 2 hours away. He did not ask. They both understood, and neither was ready to say it out loud, and that was fine. Late afternoon. Garrett closing the shop for the day. He pulled down the rolling door, turned the key, and walked home along Main Street the way he did every evening, past the hardware store pulling in its awning, past the streetlights clicking on one by one in the dusk, past Dolores waving from behind the diner counter with a coffee pot in one hand and a question she had learned not to ask in the other. Linnea walked beside him, not too close, but in step, same pace, same direction, same quiet. Neither of them spoke. Ahead, Garrett's front door was open the way he had started leaving it since the week everything changed. Theo sat on the porch step with an airplane book on his knees, looking up when he saw his father coming down the sidewalk. The boy waved. The door she knocked on at 3 in the morning was still open, and this time he didn't close it.